So good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Jennifer Sibley. I am a family peer advocate here at Northern Regional Center for Independent Living. I'm also the Parent Training and Information Coordinator under a U.S. Department of Education grant with Starbridge located in Rochester as part of a Parent Training and Information Center initiative that is nationwide. And I am super excited to have you all with us today. So with that, we are going to go ahead and get started, and we are going to be talking today about documenting educational gains and regression during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this workshop is part one of a three-part Back to School in 2020 webinar series. And I'm happy to be bringing this to you as part of a collaboration with both NRCIL, which is Northern Regional Center for Independent Living, Starbridge, and Families Together in the North Country Parent Advisors. Or I'm sorry, Families Together New York State Parent Advisors. Each Families Together in New York State does have chapters throughout the state, and so that's why I said North Country, because that's where ours is. But it is the Families Together in New York State and the Parent Advisors. For those of you who did register online, there will be part two next week on August 18th, and that is going to be on school anxiety and avoidance during COVID-19. And that will be a co-presentation with the lovely Kara Georgi and myself. Kara is going to be monitoring our chat box today, and she will be taking your questions and helping along the way to make sure that we're staying on track. And then Kara will be presenting part three on Monday, August 24th, and that will be on bridging perspectives. So with that said, before we get started into the bulk of our presentation, I did want to remind people who are just logging on that we are taking attendance by having people sign into the chat box. So if you haven't already done so, please type in your name and where you're from in the chat box. I did want to remind people that the webinar is being recorded and will be available soon on the Families Together in New York State website, as well as through the NRCIL website. If you haven't already done so, please mute your microphone so that we don't have a lot of background noise. We have over 180 participants who have registered for this workshop series, so we're hoping to minimize as much background noise as possible. And again, feel free to chat in any questions you have throughout the presentation. We will be stopping periodically to take question breaks, and we will take 30 minutes at the end of this workshop to answer any questions that have been not answered throughout the series. So with that, let's get started and talk about regression and gains during COVID-19. So we all know what happened. In March, we all got the news that our schools had to close. And with that news came the idea that our schools had no idea what to do. Suddenly they had to switch from being in person to going virtual with very little guidance on how to do so from the state. So when our schools closed, teachers and districts had to come up with a way to make it work. We all know that this led to several problems for our students. Virtual learning led to a lack of access to both the internet and to technology, led to a lack of instruction for some of our students, particularly our students with special needs who needed to have instruction in a particular way if they had an individualized education plan or a 504 plan and they needed certain accommodations. And for some of our students who had a difficult time with e-learning, it led to avoidance of participating in e-learning. What this means is that for almost every single student across the board, it led to some sort of form of regression. But what exactly is regression? When we talk about regression, we can think about it in a number of different ways. So the definition in the dictionary of regression is a return to a former or a less developed state. When we're thinking about that for our kids, it means a loss of academic, social, emotional, behavioral, or other skills that a student had prior to a gap in or a lack of services being provided, whether those are educational services or whether those are related services being provided in the school. Now, historically, when we think about regression for students with disabilities in particular, when we're discussing extended school year or ESY, we're thinking about that 2-month gap in the summertime when those students are not provided services. So we're thinking about substantial regression, and that is usually easily documented throughout the school year when we have those small gaps. And so teachers and related services staff usually have enough time to gather that documentation and say, it takes X amount of time for us to put together a plan to get the student back to where they were before this gap in learning. What happened when the school shut down is that they didn't have this time to come up with a plan for this regression. So a lot of our kids were kind of left in the lurch. So what this means is regression a big deal? It absolutely is a big deal. Now you might be asking yourself, okay, so now we know what the definition of regression is, but what does this look like? When we're thinking about academic regression, we're thinking about a loss of academic skills. For some of our students, this could look like things like forgetting what letter sounds make. So a lack of phonemic awareness. So that could be things like forgetting that when two letters are pushed together, they make a particular sound. Needing to have reminders about proper punctuation and capitalization in sentences. They might forget to carry or borrow numbers when adding or subtracting information. They might forget how to properly form letters or numbers. For some of our older students, they might forget some of the basics about looking back into the text for information. They might forget how to properly format an essay, or they might need help remembering formulas or processing information before arriving at an answer. Social and emotional regression for our kids can look different in a number of different ways. So without a regular exposure to their peers, some kids will forget important social skills that will make returning to the classroom problematic for kids. These skills could include things like using an inside voice, not blurting out answers in class, forgetting about personal space, which is going to be particularly hard when we're thinking about returning to the classroom and having to maintain 6 feet of physical distancing, sharing objects and information with other people, having conversations and remembering skills like not interrupting others and staying on topic, and having good listening skills. So I will share with you my favorite topic of conversation, which is my 17-year-old son who's on the autism spectrum. Hopefully the video works later on and you'll get to see a short snippet of some of the work that we did while the school was shut down. But Wyatt needs lots of reminders now of things that came second nature to him while he was in school, because he had lots and lots and lots of opportunities to practice those social skills while he was with his peers. So now we're having to remind him of basic skills that he had mastered before, like, Wyatt, when you're in the same room with someone, you don't need to raise your voice. I can hear you perfectly fine. Or Wyatt, you don't need to shout. I'm right next to you, bud. Or make sure you put your listening ears on. I have a feeling that you're not paying attention to me. So those are some of those basic social skills that our kids might need some reminders about when they're going back into the classroom setting. So especially for our students with disabilities who need to have explicit instruction on social skills, without regular practice, these skills will go away. So we need to take that into consideration when our kids are returning to the classroom. And emotionally, some of our kids may have a hard time coping with being back in school, particularly if school was and is a difficult thing for them. This is going to lead to a lot of not being able to cope with social situations that might have been easy for them to navigate before. So for example, a student may not want to get near anyone because they're afraid that they might contract the virus and get sick. So they may experience some social regression as a result because they're trying to find a way to protect themselves from getting ill. So these are things that we want to keep in mind and consider when our kids are going back to school. We are absolutely going to see some behavioral regression. I know that my 3-year-old was going to a preschool setting, and when school shut down, of course, his preschool shut down as well. And so we have seen a little bit of behavioral regression, not as much as I expected to see, but we have seen some behavioral regression from him, and we're having to work on those skills. And that's because, again, being around peers reinforces behavioral expectations. And a lack of routine can lead to feelings of stress, anxiety, and fear of the unknown. Also, when kids are away from school, sometimes school is their safe zone. And so being away from that safe place can lead to feelings of stress and anxiety. So being in a stressful home environment and being away from school can also contribute to an increase in negative behaviors. So things that we want to look out for as far as behavioral regression would be things like not following classroom expectations and not following regular routines that they had mastered or were able to follow before school had let out. The one thing that we look at most commonly, and the one thing that we think of most often when we're thinking about regression, is physical and other related services regression. This is oftentimes one of the easiest things to document as well. So these are the areas that we think of as far as like speech therapy, our physical skills, our fine motor skills, and our gross motor skills. Because oftentimes these are the skills that are either documented on an individualized education plan or an IEP or 504 plan, or they're getting some sort of academic improvement services that somebody is keeping track of those skills, and there's a goal associated with trying to improve those skills. So somebody is keeping track of progress that child is supposed to be making. So again, we're going to be talking a little bit later on how to document what you're seeing as far as regression in those related services skills. But this is usually the area that most parents think about when they're thinking about a regression in skills for their kids. Now, I do want to talk about the possibility of making progress while schools are closed, because it absolutely can happen. There's a lot of kids who, for whatever reason, have been very successful doing online learning, especially if those kids maybe had social anxiety before the school shut down. So now you remove the idea of being in a classroom setting with their same age peers and they can participate virtually. That removes that social barrier, and they don't have to be in the same classroom with all these people, and they can participate and get the education that they have been looking for. So it removes that school avoidance and anxiety piece. They're home, they're comfortable, and they're receiving that education that they need. Also, for kids who have issues paying attention in a large classroom setting, the virtual classroom has been very beneficial for those kids as well. So I'd like to take a break right now to answer any questions that have come up in the chat box. Kara, do we have anything that has come in?
Yes, one great question that came in that was able to be answered through chat was if this was just for service providers or for parents as well. And this is absolutely for parents as well. So I encourage any of you that are providers, feel free to share the link and registration information with families so that they can join and be a part of this. But one question that got private chatted to me, Jen, was what is something a parent could do right now as they're thinking about school starting to help kind of manage some of the regression that they've seen in terms of kind of the social interactions that their children are having?
So a good thing, and that's an excellent question. So a good thing that you might want to start thinking about is reaching out to some of the peers that have been in your child's classroom and maybe arranging for some virtual meetings with those peers. I know these, Wyatt has struggled significantly with having a lack of interaction with those peers. So we actually reached out to a couple of his classmates that he's particularly close to, and we've arranged a couple Zoom meetings with those friends. They're like 5-minute chats on the computer. He talks to them for a couple minutes. They talk about trains, which is like their favorite topic of conversation. His one buddy in his classroom, they love talking about NASCAR, and they literally just say, "Who drives this car?" And the other kid says, "Oh, it's this driver." So they had a 5-minute conversation about who drives this car. But it was a great way for him to reconnect with other classmates, and it gets his gears going as to thinking about school is coming, and I need to start thinking that instead of being home this fall, I'm actually going to be back in the classroom. So this has been really helpful for him. The other thing that I have done as a parent is I have reached out to my son's school staff and arranged for a Zoom meeting ahead of time to talk about things that might be different for him this school year. Because Wyatt is a special education student and he has a very specialized plan, I want to talk to them about those things that might look different for him. So he pushes out of the classroom for certain things. If that's not going to be a possibility due to restrictions of movement because of COVID-19, I want to be sure that I know those things ahead of time so that I can have those conversations with Wyatt and prepare him ahead of time. So I would say right now, the best thing that you can do is prepare in advance, make those connections with classmates if you can. And just start making arrangements as soon as possible to try to get your kids to reconnect to the idea of being back in school. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jen. And the only other question is, how could a parent communicate the signs of regression that they see educationally with their child that they've seen during this time of kind of remote learning with school staff, knowing that right now it's still very much up in the air of, for some districts, of how that's going to look this year? Who could they communicate with now to express some of those concerns early?
That is going to be an excellent segue into our next section. So hang on to that thought, and we will definitely cover that in our next section. Okay?
Great. Thanks, Jen. I think that is it for now. Besides, some people have asked about getting a copy of the slides, and I said we'll have that along with a survey at the end of today's presentation.
Yes, all of that information will be sent out as soon as we are done. Maybe not as soon as we are done, like the minute, but you'll get it by the end of the day, I promise. So, all right. So just like we said, now what? We have all this great information about what exactly is regression and how our kids have experienced regression. Now what do we do with this information? And the best thing I can tell you is documentation. And documentation can take many forms. So for parents, we may not be used to the idea of having to document things that we're seeing at home because we're parents, we're not teachers, and we're not trained documentation experts. And what I'm telling you is you don't have to be a documentation expert. So documentation can take many forms. It can look like their individualized education plan, if they already have one, or their IEP. Their 504 plan, report cards, notes from the teacher. We were actually kind of fortunate in the way that the shutdown happened because it was right around report card time in the end of the third quarter. So a lot of us as parents got those progress reports and those quarter reports right around when the shutdown happened. So we had that great information about where they were at right before the fourth quarter started. So we can take this information now and we can start to gather our paper trail. So the first thing we need to figure out is, where did my child start, or where was my child at when the schools first shut down in March? So different documents can help you determine where your child was at when virtual instruction started to happen. So again, report cards are great information because it gives you benchmark data, including what was their reading level at the time that the school shut down. What were they working on in math? What subjects were they struggling in, and what subjects were they doing really well with? Any progress reports from their IEP goals. How much progress had they made in achieving a goal? If you just had an IEP meeting or you were getting ready to have an IEP meeting, what kind of goals and progress were you talking about at that point in time so that those were fresh in your mind? Work samples are always a great thing to hang on to. I always try to keep copies of things throughout Wyatt's school year because that helps me keep track of what is he learning at the beginning of the year, what is he learning in the middle of the year, and what is he learning at the end of the year. And that gives me an idea of, is he making progress? If he's still adding 3-digit numbers by the end of the school year, and that's where he started at, I know that he's not making progress when it comes to his math skills. So we need to start taking a look at, if he's stuck here, is it because of the instruction is not meeting his needs, or is it because he's just not getting the concepts? Behavioral observations are gold. And behavioral observations are oftentimes difficult to prove, but you can, as long as you're keeping good documentation, you have information that you can give to the school. So if your child was having a meltdown every time that they had to get into a Zoom call with the teacher, write that down. If they were having, if they were refusing to do math homework because it was too difficult for them, keep track of those things. If you had ongoing email conversations with the teacher or other staff members because your child was struggling, those are the kinds of things that you want to keep track of. Any difficulty that you had or your child had with accessing the different learning platforms. So if your child consistently had problems logging into the Zoom meetings for the classroom, or there was a particular type of technology that the teacher wanted the child to utilize that they just couldn't use from their home computers, and there was no way to access that from any other platform, those are things that you want to keep track of as well. Now, I know we're talking about a lot of this stuff that happened in March, but you can go back and you can kind of look at some of the things that they've already done, and hopefully you can start gathering that paperwork. Some other things that you might want to take note of to include would be any content that your child struggled with, any progress related to the IEP goals, or any new skills that you noticed. So things like, we taught Wyatt how to cook grilled cheese sandwiches, which is one of his favorite foods. So we taught him the process of, you have to butter the bread, you have to turn the stove on, but you have to make sure that the burner is not on too high or it's going to burn it, and it's not too low or it's going to take forever to cook. Maybe your child was really good with Zoom meetings and was able to help other students say, oh, the chat box is down here and this is how you type stuff in, or if you want to mute yourself, you just push this button, or if you want to do this, you just push this button. Any improvement in skills that they had. Maybe you noticed that once they started typing in March, they were a hunt and peck typer, but by the time that they were done in June, they were pretty proficient with keeping their hands on the home row. Any changes in behavior that you've noticed. Maybe they were all about doing the Zoom meetings in March, but by the time June came around, they were pretty done with it. You might want to know any conversations as well that you've had with any school staff. So go back through your phone log, and anytime you had conversations with the school staff, write down the date and time that happened, so that you can kind of keep track of those conversations. And remember, emails count. So any email conversations that you had with school are also vitally important to keep track of. I tell parents that you definitely do not have to be a data collection expert, and you don't need to devote a full-time job to collecting information about regression or any educational gains. What you do need to be able to do is show where your child was and where they struggled, and where you feel they need to have some additional support in the fall based on the information that you have collected. And you need to know the difference between good data and not so good data. So good data, I tell parents, is information that can be quantified or looked at objectively. And what I mean by that is that if I look at a piece of data and Kara looks at that same piece of information, we're going to come to the same or similar conclusion about that piece of data. But if I look at a piece of data and Kara looks at it and we come to completely different conclusions about it, or we're not on the same page, that means that we're not exactly looking at good data, because that means that we're not being objective about it. We can draw our own conclusions about that information. So a good example of this would be an observation. I can walk into somebody's classroom and I can observe something, and Kara could walk into that same classroom and observe the same thing that I saw, but come to a completely different conclusion about it. Now, if I walked into a classroom with a clipboard and I was looking at the number of times that Tommy looked out the window, that's quantifiable information, because now every time he looks out the window, I can put a check mark on the page, and Kara would be able to do the exact same thing. That's targeted information. That's quantifiable information. That's information that I can target and I can take back to the team and say, this is the number of times that I've observed him looking out the window. And it doesn't take a lot of time and effort to keep track of that information. So what all this means is don't forget to document. So you might want to document worthy events. So how long did it take to complete assignments? Did they have any difficulty with assignments, like writing assignments? Was it like pulling teeth to get them to write anything down? Or did they do particularly good with reading assignments? Videos and photos are great information that you can share. And a lot of times they take a couple seconds to a minute to take a quick video and share it with the rest of the team. Any collection of work samples, and you can put those in a binder, and you can take that binder and share it with the team, send it back to the school in the fall, or you could send it into the school, drop it off at the main desk and say, this is something that I want the teacher to take a look at. Any additional materials or books that you use, you want to keep track of those things. So here's a good example. Wyatt's teacher sent home a book for him to read. It was a chapter book, and the book was about quarterbacks. And it was about this kid who wanted to, it was a twin brother, and they wanted to switch roles, and he wanted to be the quarterback on the team for the day. And his brother wanted to go to a football game with his dad. So they decided to switch places for the day. And it of course ended up being a terrible situation. Wyatt has absolutely zero interest in football. He is my indoor kid. He is not sports oriented. He could care less whether it's a football or basketball. He couldn't tell you the difference between the two of them. What he does love is trains. So we happened to find an app that was sent by his speech therapist that included a number of different books that Wyatt could choose from at his reading level. So we've happened across some nonfiction books, which most kids don't like nonfiction, but Wyatt loves nonfiction books. The more information he can get about trains, the better. So he found all of these really cool, fascinating books about trains, and he wanted to read those. He couldn't get enough of them. So I talked to the teacher and I said, look, he has completely written off this book. It's hard for me to get him to sit down and focus for the 20 minutes you want him to read every day. It's pulling teeth. I can get him to read these books, and he wants to read more of them. And she said, by all means, supplement the reading. If he's willing to read those books and not the one that I sent home, as long as he's reading, that's the thing that I care about the most. So those are the kinds of things that you want to keep track of. So I wrote down a list of the books that he read instead of the quarterback book, and I sent that to the school with him at the end of the year, so that she had a list of the books that he read and the information that he gathered from those books. So that's some of those that documentation that you want to keep. Any observations or statements that your child has made. So if you're finding that your kid is always coming to you and saying, I don't understand this math homework, I'm really struggling with it, I can't figure out how to figure this formula out. If you're finding that they're consistently coming to you with the same issues, those are the kinds of things that you want to document as well. Feedback is important. So did your child receive related services during the shutdown? And what did this look like? Was it as often as it was supposed to be, as it was written on their individualized education plan? And how did they do with telehealth services? So all of that is great information to provide back to the school about, what was their experience and what was your experience with accessing all this information. So what I want to share with you right now is a quick video that I took of Wyatt counting change. So Wyatt is in a 1213 self-contained special education classroom. And one of the things that he struggles with is counting money. So ignore the mess on my counter and hopefully the video works, but this is going to be Wyatt counting change. It's a quick 45-minute video that we took and sent to his teachers.
60, 80.
No,
70,
count them again. Count them again. Count them again. Slow down.
10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80.
Good job. How much money do we need?
2,
So we've got 80. How much money do we need?
86.
So what do you think?
81,
There's 81.
82, 83, 84, 85, 86.
Good job. Can you put it in the cup?
Uh-oh.
So the reason I share that is because, you know, up until that point, we had no idea that Wyatt knew how to skip count by tens. We thought he could only skip count by fives. So it was pretty fascinating when we discovered he could count by tens. But on top of that, he had just been doing worksheets up to that point to count change. So I took that quick video as a way to kind of mix up him doing worksheets all the time. And his teacher was very impressed with that he could actually count the change physically and put it in the cup and figure out different creative ways to come up with 86 cents or whatever the change might be. And again, that's the kind of thing that you want to start documenting. So it's too late to kind of go back and do all those things now. But if at some point we end up going virtual for any reason, you can start keeping track of those things and keep those things in mind. So before we go into what does all this mean and how do we take all this information to the school, Kara, did we have any other questions that came up?
We had one person type in and share about an observation that they made about their child of how their son struggled with understanding what to read, but from being home, they noticed him reading out loud to one of us would help him remember the reading better. And I pointed out that that's a great example to share with the teachers in the school. And so thinking of little things like that. So Jen gave you some concrete examples, but even general things. For example, with me, my children, my oldest learns best in the morning. My youngest learns best in late afternoon, evening. So knowing things about like that about your child can really help teachers, because that's when there's a challenge they might be experiencing, that then you're going to be able to tell them this is going to be the time of day where you might have the most success. Because we all know little things that can make big differences for our children. Other than that, I don't see any other questions at this point, Jen.
Okay. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much. These are really great questions and observations. Thank you for being so participatory. I really appreciate it. So now, what does all this mean? How are we going to wrap up all this information and take it back to our schools to help our child make sure that when they start school in the fall, they're going to start school off the right way? Well, everything we do with the school is a team effort. So if your child has an individualized education plan or a 504 plan, what you want to do is start right now and write to your chairperson and request a program review or some sort of team meeting so that you can talk about any observations that you made during the shutdown and possibly any changes that you need to have made to the IEP, as well as any services that you're looking for. So when you make that request, share the purpose of the meeting in your request. Let them know that you want to discuss the regression of skills that you've seen over the last 6 months and that you're possibly seeking additional supports. Be prepared to share your evidence with the rest of the team. So if you're going to be meeting virtually, email copies to the CSE chairperson, the Committee on Special Education chairperson, sorry, trying not to use a lot of acronyms, the Committee on Special Education chairperson, so that they can send it to the other team members. Now, what if your child is not classified and they don't have special education services, but you've noticed that they've struggled with skills over this shutdown? All is not lost. You can still talk to your child's building principal, because your building principal is the one who can oversee all of those services and supports for your child. So you can reach out to your child's building principal and ask that they have a meeting. And he or she can arrange to have your child's teacher, and if possible, both your teacher for this upcoming school year and the teacher from last year, and any other person who might be working with your child throughout their school day. So, for example, if they might be receiving academic intervention services, that person might want to join the meeting as well. Or if your concern is about regression in reading skills, maybe your school has a reading specialist who might want to sit in on that team meeting. And again, share your documentation. If the meeting is virtual, make sure you send your documentation well in advance so that it can be distributed to the team. So just like you wouldn't want the school to have information that they're sharing with themselves and not sharing with you, as a parent, I wouldn't want the same thing to happen. So if I'm looking at information that I feel is important to talk about with my child, I would want to share that with the rest of the team so that we're all on the same page and we're all making good, sound decisions about what needs to be done. So once you've made that request for a meeting, you want to make sure that you're preparing ahead of time. So make a list of your talking points. And what I do is I put my top priorities at the very top of that list. So these are my 2 or 3 things that this is the hill I'm willing to die on. These are the 2 or 3 things that I am not willing to negotiate on. And the rest of the things are things that I'm willing to have conversations about and willing to negotiate with the school. Make sure if you do have documentation, again, you've sent copies of it to the school so that everybody's on the same page. And make sure your documentation is organized. The last thing you want to do is go into your meeting and have to be shuffling through papers because you're not sure where you put that sample work of the math worksheets that you went through. Always talk to others about your concerns and get multiple perspectives. Sometimes as parents, it's so easy for us to view things through the parent bubble. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes we can kind of lose our focus because we're so focused on the needs of our child. So we want to get multiple perspectives. So talk to other people, talk to friends, talk to people who maybe have worked with your child in the past. Talked to advocates. Kara and I are both trained special education advocates. So we're more than happy to talk to you about any kind of concerns or questions that you might have about going into the school meetings. Be prepared to negotiate and compromise. There's going to be certain things that the school just isn't able to accommodate right now, especially because of the new COVID-19 regulations and trying to comply with CDC guidelines and the governor's regulations. There's just certain things that they're not going to be able to do. What I always tell parents is if a school tells you, I just can't do that, ask them to put that in writing. Because chances are, if they're not willing to put it in writing, then they're probably not basing it on anything other than an unwillingness to meet you halfway. But if they are willing to put it in writing, then chances are they're basing it on sound facts. Make sure you know your rights going into the meeting. At the very end of the presentation, I'm going to share with you guys some great resources that you can check out about education related to COVID-19 so that you can look into those resources before you go into any kind of meeting and know what your rights are before you go in. I do want to remind you that every school district in New York State is required to post their reopening plans on their district's website. And according to the governor's new reopening guidelines, every district is supposed to be having reopening forums for the community. So look on your district's website, check to see when those forums are going to be happening. and read up on your district's reopening plans if you have any questions about anything. And then if something doesn't strike you as sounding right, or you have concerns about those, absolutely reach out to your school. You are a community member, you're sending your child to that school, you have a right to ask those questions. Know that your child, regardless of what's going on, has a right to a free and appropriate public education. So you're sending your child into that school, and just because you're sending your child to that school doesn't mean that they can skimp on services. So if you feel strongly that they need to have these services in order to get a quality education that is appropriate for their needs, then you should be fighting for that. And consider bringing someone with you for support. So even if your meeting is going to be virtual on the computer, it's not going to be face-to-face, or even if it is going to be face-to-face, consider bringing someone with you. I'm a trained family peer advocate. I've been doing this job for almost 13 years now, and I still bring an advocate with me to Wyatt's meetings, because being a parent is an emotional experience, and there's lots of times where I still have emotional breakdowns in Wyatt's meetings because I can't help it. We're talking about my child, and it's a very personal thing that's happening. So you want to bring someone with you who can look at things a little bit more objectively and can provide information and ask those questions that maybe you didn't think to ask ahead of time. I want to talk very briefly too about one of the buzzwords that are going around right now, and that's something called compensatory education. Does the school owe my child services? So compensatory education is services owed by a school district as a result of the lack of provision of services that are of no fault of the child. So this is sometimes a speech therapist might be sick, or your child had to go to a doctor's appointment. So if the speech therapist is not available, then they would usually do some sort of makeup session for that. But if your child is not available for whatever reason, they typically don't provide a makeup session for that unless you ask for one. So a lot of times they talk about compensatory services when inadequate services are available, and they're listed on an IEP, but they're not received by a student. So we historically have thought of compensatory education when we think about a child is supposed to get 5 days of speech per week, but their speech therapist is only available 3 days a week. And so they're only getting 3 days when they're supposed to be getting 5, and so they have to provide those makeup sessions. But when COVID-19 hit and the school shut down in March, suddenly the schools had to kind of scramble to figure out, what are we going to do for these related services for our kiddos? So compensatory services are not specifically listed under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, nor are they listed specifically in state education, special education guidelines. So that's something important to keep in mind, is that there is no statutory regulation regarding compensatory ed. Instead, the basis for a lot of compensatory services is actually rooted in special education case law. So I would highly recommend going to rightslaw.com, which again, that resource is going to be available to you at the end of this webinar. And rightslaw.com has an entire page devoted to compensatory education services if you're looking for more information about that. Now, typically discussions about compensatory education take place when a student, again, has missed services as a result of services not being available. But when school shut down, there really was no mechanism in place to provide and bill for virtual services. Also, other services kind of had to take place and take priority. So things like food services and providing classroom education services. So the related services kind of had to take a back seat while they put those priority services in place. But a lot of districts within a few weeks started to look into and explore things like telehealth services. So providing things like speech therapy and occupational therapy through virtual services. What that looked like for a lot of students is that they would send home a permission form that parents had to sign and send back, saying that, yes, I give permission for the speech therapist to provide services through telehealth. And then arrangements were made where your child would sit on the computer and receive those services. Other districts would often opt for providing packets of information to parents, and then that packet of information was designed to enhance skills or at least maintain skills for that student. And then what the therapist would do would call the parent and check in to see what kind of progress the child was making. This was a lot less effective than doing the telehealth services, but it was deemed as somewhat appropriate in the eyes of state ed while they were trying to figure out what was going on with everything. Again, the key component of this is document, document, document. So if you feel like your child lost significant skills throughout this process, be prepared to show your documentation and negotiate for additional services. Remember that compensatory education does not mean a one-to-one makeup. So if your child missed 15 sessions of speech, that doesn't mean that the school owes you 15 speech sessions. What it means is that the school has to provide additional sessions to help return your child to where they were before the pandemic, or at least somewhere reasonably close to that. But again, you have to provide your documentation and be willing to compromise with your school. If you think about it, every single child in your school district is in the same boat. And if they had to provide compensatory education to every single student who was receiving speech therapy services, they would be backlogged for months. So be willing to negotiate, but know your rights. If you feel like your child really needs speech services and you're only asking for one additional session per week or an extra 15 to 40 or 30 minutes per week, be willing to negotiate on that and stand your ground. Know what your rights are, and if you really feel like your school is not addressing your concerns, you can always reach out to an advocate to help you work with your school district. I know I didn't build in a question break there, Kara, but were there any questions that came up about compensatory education?
There was only one question that just came in tied to that specifically. And it was when a school sends home packets of worksheets for speech and occupational therapy or OT services, would this be considered appropriate services for a child that needs speech and occupational therapy, or can a parent ask for compensatory services?
Again, it's going to depend on the level of progress that was made. A lot of these services that were provided during this shutdown weren't necessarily designed to enhance the skills, but to at least maintain where your child was at so that they didn't experience a lot of substantial regression. So if you feel like that wasn't enough and that your child had a lot of regression as a result of not receiving the speech services, gather your documentation together. So if your child was speaking in full sentences before the shutdown and now they're struggling to put those sentences together, those are things that you want to keep or write down and present to your CSE. If they were able to label things in their environment with relative ease and now they're struggling to come up with labels for things, that's another thing that you want to know. So put your documentation together and then take that back to the school and say, these are the observations that I've had. And again, be willing to negotiate. If the school says we can't provide those services, ask them to put that in writing. And then if you feel strongly that they're not willing to work with you, contact an advocate, because that's always a route that you can take.
And there was one other question that came in, Jen, in terms of the point that I raised about the different times of day of your child learning. There's a little more flexibility when your children are in the older grades in terms of adjusting their scheduling. It's more just information that's beneficial to know kind of in the early elementary years. And I would say, as Jen has with a lot of this, it is not necessarily what is best for our kids when they're in school, but what is appropriate so that they have access to getting an education. So that's really important. There were one other question, Jen, that was kind of raised in terms of the compensatory services. What if there is a lack of therapists or providers for a district or area? What should a family do in that situation?
So if there was a lack of therapists or providers, that speaks to a bigger problem than just the pandemic itself. More than likely that issue was going on before the pandemic hit. So again, I would document the sessions that were missed and any attempts on your part to contact the school and find out what was going on with the therapist, whether they had been trying to seek out therapy services. The school has to prove on their end that they were at least seeking out someone to provide therapy services. It's not enough for them to say, oh, well, we don't have a speech therapist. Sorry, it stinks to be you. They have to show state ed that they've made attempts to contact someone and fill that position. So again, documentation is going to be your friend in that case. So if you reached out and said, you know, what's progress on getting a speech therapist? Do you have anybody? Have you contacted anyone? Even if you could reach out and provide, you know, find a private speech therapist who would be willing to work with you, you could send that information to the school district and ask if they would be willing to contract with this provider until they could find someone who would be available through the school district itself. So there's always different options that you can explore, but have those ongoing conversations with the school. If you're willing to let those conversations drop, then the school is willing to forget that this is an issue for you. So the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Make sure that you're continuing to have those conversations, that you're reaching out to the school. And if they're not providing the service, document what services you're not being provided and ask for another meeting so that you can get an update on the progress. Any other questions? All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to power through the last 7 minutes according to my watch. So at your meeting, you're going to calmly share your observations of your child at home. Now, I shared a video of Wyatt earlier. I did that with his permission. So I asked him, hey, Wyatt, can I put this in my presentation? I'm going to share it with a whole bunch of people today. And he's like, yeah. So, so just make sure that if you are going to be sharing things like videos or pictures of your child, that you get your child's permission to do so. It's their private information as well. So even though it's a team of people who's working with your child, you do want to get your child's permission to share that because it is very private information. So again, calmly share your observations with your child at home. Listen to updates from the teachers. Even if you don't necessarily agree with those updates, make sure that you're gathering all of that information and you're listening to everything. You want to listen to hear, you don't want to listen to speak. So make sure that you're listening to what everybody is telling you and taking that information in. Make sure that you're discussing your concerns, and if you feel like your child needs additional support, be able to state why they need support and share your documentation. Again, know what your rights are. If you disagree with the committee or with the team, you can always ask that they have a third party come in and do mediation. If your child is already classified as a student with a disability, you can exercise your due process rights and state, I disagree with the committee's decision and I would like to have due process. You can always ask for another meeting, and that's usually the best way to try to mediate any concerns that you have. And again, you can contact a family peer advocate to assist you with the process, or legal support is always available if you feel like that's where the situation has escalated to. I always suggest too that you end your meeting by thanking everyone for their time. It's rare that I find that I go to a meeting with the school where somebody is out to get a child or to put a family down. Most people are there at that school for your child's best interest. Whether it meets your needs or your level of concern or not, they're still taking time out to have those conversations with you. So thank everyone for their time and for their consideration with your child. And make sure that you're letting them know that even though you don't agree with them, you're still thanking them for being there. So what's next? So as we move forward, we have a small idea now of what to expect for the 2020 and 2021 school year. As I said earlier, Governor Cuomo has opened up New York State schools to be able to open for this school year, and has asked schools to submit their plans for reopening. So again, you can look on your school's website to find out what their specific plans are. And under his guidance, he has said that school districts need to have at least 3 public forums for reopening. And I believe in larger areas such as New York City and some of the larger cities like Albany, they have to have 5 public forums. Don't quote me on that. Please don't come back and say Jen Sibley said this and she was wrong, because I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's what I heard. But again, if you have concerns, do your research and look. It should be on your school's website. Be prepared to document concerns from day one. So that first day that your child goes to school this school year, be prepared to document concerns. Grab a notebook, write things down, have conversations with your child. Make sure that you're emailing the teacher of anything that comes up. Act sooner rather than later. It's harder to address concerns after they've happened. So if you wait 2 to 3 weeks into the school year and realize that, uh-oh, now I'm starting to see something and it's getting to be too late to try to deal with this, it's going to be harder to deal with at that point than it is to say, this is something that I'm starting to see and maybe I should speak up about it now. We all need to be prepared to return to virtual learning in the event that the school needs to close again. For instance, if they have a positive case that comes up, they're going to have to close the schools down to do deep cleaning. So be prepared to return to virtual learning and know that that's a real possibility for this school year. So even if your child is going to be returning 5 days a week full-time as a special education student, be prepared to have that eventuality where they're going to be back home and doing virtual learning. So be prepared, have that set up, make sure that you're able to document any concerns that you're seeing from home. Communication is going to be key in this process. So make sure that you're having, again, ongoing conversations with your teacher, ongoing conversations with your child's team. If there's questions about anything related to the building's reopening plan, you can have those conversations with your school's building principal or your administration. And be flexible. The thing to remember is that schools are trying to figure this out as they go too. They've had not a lot of guidance, honestly, from state ed. And state ed has not had a lot of guidance from the governor's office. I'm thinking back to June when the governor said, yeah, you can do in-person learning in July. And that was it. So there was really no guidance on what in-person learning looked like for summer school. So a lot of schools were scratching their heads going, what does that mean? Does that mean that we do social distance? We don't social distance? Do we wear a mask? Do we not wear a mask? Is that all kids? Is it just our special ed kids? What does this mean for us? And they really didn't get any guidance up until like the 11th hour. And even that was just, well, follow the CDC guidelines. Well, that's great and really not much more helpful. So again, be flexible. Schools are willing or learning as they go to. Be willing to work with your school to come up with solutions because this is a complex and ever-changing situation. So just as we're trying to figure everything out, our schools are trying to figure everything out too. So these are the resources that I wanted to point you in the direction of. Again, if you go to rightslaw.com, they have a plethora of information about special education law and regulation. It's actually written by a team of lawyers who specialize in special education law. And right on their main page is a whole bunch of talking points about coronavirus and COVID-19. So if you're interested in any information related specifically to the virus and reopening of schools, you can go to rightslaw.com. Of course, you can always go to the New York State Education Department website. So it's niced.gov/coronavirus, or you can go to the federal website, ed.gov/coronavirus. And if you're looking for some general information about, how do I do good documentation? What's a great way to contact my school? I need a sample letter. Starbridgeinc.org has a lot of great resources on how to get your documentation in a row, what kind of information you need to have with you, and how to put your concerns in writing. And again, these slides will be shared with you guys after our presentation today. And so with that, on behalf of Families Together New York State and the parent advisors, NRCIL and Starbridge, I really want to thank you all for attending today's webinar on documenting educational gains and regression during COVID-19. And at this point, if there's any other questions, I'd like to open it up for questions.
Thanks so much, Jen. It was a great presentation with a lot of good information for all of us. I wanted to share, there were a couple questions. One of them, a parent, I believe, was asking, they have a child that has a lot of anxiety and they're wondering if they should just do the whole virtual school, the hybrid school. And I think as Jen was closing out the presentation, she really captured it best in that even the best laid plan this year is subject to change. There's so many unknowns ahead for the districts, for us as families. So what I've been trying to help families understand is do what you think is right for your child, for your family situation, knowing how you felt when it kind of got sprung on you last March. How did that work out for your whole family unit? And in terms of supporting your child with their anxiety, what would be the most supportive right now? Another great question that came in kind of tied to that, Jen, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, are what type of normal, like how do we prepare our students for what they are potentially walking into if they do go back to school or participate in a hybrid model? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I could share a couple of suggestions as well if you'd like.
Sure. So there's actually a lot of really great resources out there that you can tap into depending on what your child's ability levels are and what their, where they're at as far as their cognitive skills are. One of the things that's worked really well with Wyatt is there's a website called Autism Little Learners, and they have some great social stories that have been very helpful for him so far in teaching him about why it's important to wash your hands frequently and why it's important to wear a mask when we go out in public. And so I should have put that in the resources, and I don't know if Kara, you can type that into the chat box or not. It's Autism Little Learners. If you Google it, it'll come up with a whole bunch of great information. But there's great social stories in there for kiddos who might have some delayed cognitive skills. And I would say just have good conversations with your kids. Talk to them about their fears and their concerns and their questions. Make sure that you're familiar with what your school's plan is. The more information that you have, the better equipped you are to answer those questions from your child. I know that my school district is having 3 Facebook Live forums over the next couple of weeks, and I'm planning on attending all 3 of them. Just because I know that each session is going to garner different questions from the audience that they're going to be asking. And those are things that maybe I didn't think of, but another parent is going to attend that session and come up with that question. And I'm going to go, oh my gosh, that's a great question to ask. And I didn't think about that. I wonder how the school's going to answer that. And I'm the kind of parent who actually goes through and reads the school's reopening plan. So I have read my school district's plan from front to back. So I know everything that's in there. I know the contingency plans. I know what their thoughts are on, cleaning protocols and social distancing. I know what their thoughts are on one-to-one aid support. I know what their thoughts are on, lunch plans as far as the kids are going to be eating in the classroom and not eating in the cafeteria. So those are the kinds of questions that as a parent I was thinking of, but they've already answered. So, more information is good information. And again, have your kids come up with those questions. For Wyatt, he needs lots of time to process. So I've talked to him in small spurts, and he gets overwhelmed easy. So I say to him, what do you think about going back to school, bud? And his first response is always, no school, no go back to school. I say, okay, let's talk about it. Let's think about it. And so a couple minutes later, he'll come back and he'll go, Mommy, we go back to school? I'll say, yep. He goes, I have to ride the bus? Yep, you have to ride the bus. I wear a mask on the bus? Yes, buddy, you have to wear your mask on the bus. I sit with Mrs. So-and-so because he has an aide on the bus. Yep, but you're probably not going to sit in the same seat with Mrs. So-and-so. They're probably going to sit in the seat across from you. Okay, And then a few hours later, I'll say, why are you excited about going back to school? No school. And then he'll come up with another question. So have those ongoing conversations with your child. And depending, again, on their cognitive level, their communication skills, you can have those, but be prepared to answer those questions by being prepared with the information. So I'll stop talking now and give Kara an opportunity.
Thanks, Jen. Those were all really good ideas. Other things that I've been suggesting is if families know, because I know some in the chat have typed that like this is going to be a hard year for all students, whether they have disabilities or not. We don't essentially know what those students are walking into, what it's going to look like. And I've been talking with some districts about actually taking pictures and putting up like a virtual slideshow on their district website. So families can point their children there to kind of start looking at, oh, this is what my classroom might look like. And oh, this is how school's going to look different. There's arrows on the floor. So things like that could be potentially helpful. As Jen said, asking your kids to help come up with those questions. And I have found talking with some families, they're nervous to ask the school because they feel like the school is really busy and they're not just going to have the time, or they're going to be annoyed that they're asking these questions. To be honest with you, the school really appreciates it of you asking these questions. As Jen said, they're going to be doing these public hearing sessions. And if they know some of the things on some parents' minds, that's going to better inform them of the content they need to include for other families. So ask those questions. I can share with you personally too, in terms of thinking of where you might funnel your questions. If it's something that you think your building administrator can answer, I suggest you start there. I know for us personally, I reached out with my superintendent because I really wanted to understand our district overall and how it was going to affect both of my children. And he's crazy busy, but by reaching out to my building principal, I had an answer before the end of the day. So I encourage you, really think through your chain of command. Also think of who are those people that can kind of be the people that are the bright spots that you could remind your children of. Like Jen said, the person sitting with your child on the bus, the person who they might see that could greet them, and see how you can build in those pieces of having your children find a way to look forward to potentially going back to school. So anything like that can be super helpful. Also, someone put in like running through their schedule and kind of talking through that. Talk with the school of what is their day going to look like when they go back to school? How might it be different? So you can prepare children for what that different is. But I think also teaching your children about flexibility and that things can change in a moment. You might have the best laid plan and something's going to come up and cause it to change. And how do we teach our kids that change isn't always necessarily bad, but sometimes it's going to be okay. Change can work out. So preparing your children for that, because should someone in their classroom get sick, should something happen, something might need to change for them, and we want to help prepare them for that.
And to add to that too, Kara, I would say, again, go to your school district's website, because a lot of them do have a mechanism built in already for parents to type questions in, and they've already appointed someone to answer COVID-related questions. So if you do have a question related to school reopening, I'm almost going to guarantee you that another parent out there has that same exact question and is afraid to ask it. So go to the website, type in that question, attend the forums, because they're taking that information in and they're going to say, oh, we got this really great question in through our website and we're going to answer this during the public forum. And you ask that question and now 5 other parents are going to get the answer to that question. So those are really great things to keep in mind.
And I think too, thinking ahead to the school year, for me, when we went into remote learning, my youngest is in love with horses. That's all initially she wanted to learn about. So finding things for your kids' interests now to help prepare for if you do end up going into a complete remote situation, or just thinking through who are the people that you can reach out to support you also. Because I think sometimes we get so focused on the teaching and the education piece, we forget that us as parents are going through a lot right now. So I encourage you to think of who those buddies are going to be to help you get through this school year. So as much as we're getting our kids ready with their friends, let's also make sure we as parents have that support too. And Sue Wyatt shared too of one district is actually preparing videos of the inside of school of how to navigate the one-way stairwells, what lunch will look like and things like that for each building. Schools are really truly trying to figure out how to support us, how to support their staff, and how to support their students. So if you have a creative idea, share it, because it could really truly make the difference for other families in your school district. And I think for Jen and I, that's one of the interesting and tricky parts for us this year of helping families, is that every school district truly has their own unique plan. And so that is why it's so important to attend those information sessions and know what your district's plan is, not because we can't help, but because it'll better inform you to help inform us when we're working with you to help support your child.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Let's see. This has been a great audience, Jen.
I love it. I'm in the chat box now too, so I'm looking through and seeing what's on there. While Kara's looking back through the chat box, I do want to remind everyone that the next webinar in our series is going to be next week on Tuesday at the same time, 10 a.m. And that is going to be on school avoidance and anxiety during COVID-19. And that will actually be a co-presentation between Kara and myself. So you'll get both of us again. And we will be sending that registration link out as soon as we are done here or very shortly after.
I don't see any more questions at this time, Jen.
Okay.
But I want to just raise that point too, that was raised very early in today's presentation, that if you know of a family that could benefit or someone who works with families that might benefit from hearing the information, we encourage you to share the registration link. We would love to have them join us and be able to share this information out as far and wide as we can as we all navigate what 2020 school year is going to look like.
Absolutely. And just a reminder to everyone as well that if you have not already signed in through the chat box just by typing in your name and where you're from, please do so. We want to make sure that you get credit for attending today's workshop, especially if you're trying to attend all three and get your certificate. So again, if you haven't already signed into the chat box with your name and where you're from, please do so. And I really, really, really appreciate everyone's time today. I know that everybody's schedules are busy, especially with back to school coming up. So thank you all so very much for your attendance today and your time and your great conversation. This has been very, very wonderful. So thank you all so very much. And with that, I will say have a great rest of your day, and we will see you all again next week.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.